Hello, everyone. How are you doing today? Today we are finally doing a review, and it is none other than the classic, oft-quoted, often commentated upon, often misquoted part of the time, uh, George Orwell's 1984. Um, so it may seem that 1984, why did I read this book? Yes, part of it is because of current events, current issues that are going on. But the other part of that is hearing a very numerous group of people on many sides of the political spectrum talking about 1984, quoting 1984. Um, and I've never read it. This is the first time I've actually read the book. So I wanted to take the time to read the book for myself, kind of get my own feelings about it, see what all the talk is about, and to see why it is such an influential book. Part of the reason why it is such an influential book is it's written by one of the greatest writers in history, in my opinion. George Orwell is fantastic, even though I've only read one other work of his, which actually isn't even a book. It was just an essay on Mein Kampf. He has such an insight into the human personality, the human intellect, just kind of that whole sphere of the human experience, that I feel very few writers get to, at least to the degree that Orwell does. I think that's what makes him special, and I also think that that's what makes 1984 a classic. Because he's touching on things that aren't just within a specific time period. I mean, 1984 came out in 1949, right after World War II. There's an obvious commentary on the horrors of Nazism and Stalinism, that Orwell is alluding to, but it still was applicable when he published it in 49. It's still applicable as it went through the 50s, when the afterword that is in this copy in the 60s, and it's still applicable to this day because Orwell touches upon universal human ideas and issues. That's why personally I don't feel that 1984 is a political book. It is much more of a philosophical book, and that's why it is a classic. That's why it is still as popular as it was 70 years ago, because it touches on those universal things. There are aspects of 1984 that will feel more applicable for certain people. Obviously, if you live in UK, George Orwell was British. There'll be certain things that will speak to you more. I mean, especially since the totalitarian regime in 1984 is known as INGSOC, which is short for English Socialism. The story takes place in England, I believe in London, although I don't know if it's actually specifically mentioned. If you're in a country that speaks English and your law is based upon English law, there are going to be certain aspects of it that will be that will feel like they apply more to you. If you're in one of the Western countries that kind of has a foundation based on Roman law, because all these things play into each other, yes, those are going to be aspects that are probably going to be more relatable to you, that you're going to understand better. But this is a universal book. Anyone who is able to read this book, whether in English or in another language, they can understand these things, and that's because by the nature it is philosophical. It is not political, and that's why you see the problems that 1984. It's happening right now in countries across the world, because these are the reason why these issues are happening is philosophical. It's human. It's not just political. Politics is how it's expressed, and that is how 1984 is a classic, why it still stands the test of time. Obviously, as opposed to a lot of other classical literature, 1984 has a lot of motifs or little things that, as a culture, even to this present day, we like to hold on to. We hear terms of like Big Brother, we hear terms of like thought crime and newspeak and ignorance is peace. Those are things that have kind of come into the everyday parlance. But those are just little bits of 1984. It's not the whole aspect of it. And so obviously, as with anything, it gets picked up and it kind of gets run with. So we see an example of something we don't like. We're like, oh well, there's Big Brother. Oh well, look, there's Newspeak. Oh well, ignorance is strength. Oh look at thought crime. And I'm not trying to diminish any of those feelings, but the point of this video is not to make political statements in the same way that 1984 is not trying to make a political statement. I mean, it is to a certain extent of like, hey, beware lest this happen. But the reasons why all these things happen, the reason why Big Brother gets into power, it's all philosophical. It's in the heart. It's in the mind. And so that's what I'm, in this review kind of touching upon is what's in the heart, what's in the mind. Why is this a classic? Why do I enjoy it? And that is my general feelings of the book. Is I find it to be an enjoyable, very well written book. I also feel that the main character of Winston, the protagonist, is both unique, and also I feel that the tack that they take him, he's not really an insider, but he's not really an outsider in this society, because in Ingsoc society, you're either part of the inner party, you're part of the outer party, or you're the proletariat. Now, the proletariat are the biggest group, but, they're kind of like the untouchables, for lack of a better term. They're just kind of this huge morass of, anonymous faces that kind of just run into each other. The book really isn't concerned about the proletariat. In the same way that the book isn't really concerned about the inner party or the outer party. It is concerned about the individual. Now, there are aspects of all three parties that the book goes into that is important. It builds this whole motif. It builds this whole beautiful, weaving, thought-provoking tapestry with every aspect of this, but it's not specific. Winston goes from thinking, oh, our salvation will be in the proletariat, and then, in the end, he doesn't feel that way. I'm going to try not to spoil things. However, when I do get to specific feelings about specific things in the book, there will be spoilers. So, Winston, as in any good book, he does not finish where he started out. But I feel like I've lost my train of thought a little bit, but all of this is just to kind of, I feel like I'm still just kind of attesting to why is this a classic? Why is it so well beloved? Why is it so well, why do people keep quoting it? And it's all these reasons. It's human, it's personal, it's different, it's unique, but it touches on all these fears. It's part of this negative utopia, as the person in the afterword wrote. It's a combination of the fears that we have in humanity, of a society that seems to be becoming increasingly callous because of what horrors were unleashed upon us by both the world wars, and how those things have changed, how they have changed us, and what they may become. 1984 is totally a warning. It is a warning that many have not heeded, regardless of what your political affiliations are. There are some things that are universally concerning. So, and 1984 speaks to that. I mean, I kind of find it funny, at least in the American perspective, because, most people of a conservative persuasion quote 1984, yet George Orwell was a socialist, someone who would be considered on the left, or at least on the left side of the spectrum. And again, that is going towards the whole universal nature of 1984, attesting to the strength of it. And, you do see people on the other side of the political spectrum talking about 1984 as well, because it's so super applicable. This book is extraordinarily strong in the statements and thoughts that it makes, and not statements so much like it's preaching, but it's like, oh, I read that. I see the point you're trying to make there. And that's another thing, too, that 1984 isn't preachy in the slightest. Orwell is, even though Orwell was a socialist himself, he had a very critical eye towards socialism, as I think people should have about their beliefs. It's okay to believe what you believe, but have a critical look at them, understand why you believe them, and be willing to say something about it when those sorts of things come up. and you have that disagreement about. Not to say that people can't be quiet about stuff, because I tend to be mind my own business sort of person, but you get the idea of what I'm saying. We need to be well informed of what we believe. And George Orwell, he writes this as a resource. Even though it's completely fictional, it is a resource for each and every person to think about these things, to open their eyes and think about, oh, well, what may my certain political persuasion, is my certain political persuasion, my beliefs, and the things that I'm wanting to do outward, externally, like I have my thoughts as a person, but how I apply them externally in politics, am I falling into any of that? And I think that's one thing that can kind of get lost in all of our quotations of 1984, is we don't take the personal aspect of it. And I think that's the most important aspect of 1984, because it's so easy to be like, oh yes, look at this this is the blueprint, it's the blueprint, you see what the government's doing, they're doing it right now, they just ripped it straight out of these pages. It's so easy to do that whenever we get incensed. And I understand not everyone is that way, but we all have that tendency, that draw, however, to what degree incensed may be, about things. It's easy to get caught up on that and not to have any chance of self-reflection. And so I think that's one big thing that gets lost. Another thing, before I kind of get into spoilers, and I'm getting more into my specific feelings about the book, is one thing that really hit me with the book. Obviously, there's the motifs that have translated into, common parlance: Big Brother, telescreen, thought crime, newspeak. The three slogans: war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. And then another motif that you can kind of see in certain areas, especially. There are some applications to it in the United States, is turning children against parents. Although, to a more historical aspect of it, this was something that was actively done in the Soviet Union. The government actively wanted wanted the children to rat out their parents if they did anything that was contrary to state thought. So, while this is a sci-fi novel, Orwell is basing many of these things on actual historical things, events, and practices that happened, and we continue to see that applied, because we want to dabble in what we feel like we want to dabble in, because it allows our side, whatever side that may be, it promulgates our belief rather than just trying to have a conversation with someone. So beyond kind of those overall motifs that people generally know very well about, certain things that stuck out to me. One thing that I've never heard about before anyone talk about is the 2-minute hate. That, more than anything else, I think if you came in 1984 with no knowledge of kind of like the flash words, the quotations, the things that people like to use, perhaps maybe this scene, this 2-minute hate, wouldn't be as impactful as some of the other things that happen in the book. But for me, it was. For me, it was the event that got the most emotional response out of me. It was the one that made me go, whoa, this is scary. This is terrifying. I see this happening in society. And basically, the 2-minute hate is an organized, before everyone gets together to kind of have, a political meeting, a mandatory political meeting at the factory. I think it's the factory. But before they kind of get into all the announcements, they have this thing called the 2-minute hate. And basically all it is it's the government showing the picture of the enemy of the state, Goldstein, and people just, the whole point of it is just for people to get irate and mindless. They literally just show a picture, if I recall correctly. It did take me a while to get through this book. So we're talking about months, just because of my schedule. So I may be misremembering things a little bit. But they just take these 2 minutes to scream, yell, curse, people just lose their minds for 2 minutes. And for me, the reason why it had such an impact on me is because, oh my gosh, I'm seeing this, it's obviously, it's not equivalent, but you're seeing this on social media where you just see people absolutely, people absolutely lose their minds. They're just totally being fueled on hate and anger and just that emotion, and there's nothing else going on. And you're seeing that increasingly in real life as well. And so that's something that was, it's like, look, you don't even need a single figure for the state to point you towards. Humanity is more than willing to just do that itself, because we become so unreasonable in our beliefs that we can't stand to hear other people say a belief contrary, or basically that. You see examples of like with Jordan Peterson is one famous example. You see of other speakers, being shouted out of speaking engagements. You see people being canceled because of, I can't remember her name, but like there was the one woman who was a porn star who was at, she holds conservative values, and again, I'm not trying to get anything political here, but she holds values to a convention of conservative values, and conservatives are supposed to be the people who are against canceling, and yet they totally canceled her. So you see all these examples of people like, oh, well, you're just on this opposite side, so you just get 2 barrels of rage blasting right at you. And that's all the thought process that's put into that. So I saw a very huge equivalent to the 2-minute hate. Now, obviously, it's much more concentrated. It's much more organized than kind of what we're seeing. But it was one of those things where it's like, that terrifyingly moved me. So that was a very impactful scene. Like I said, the one that kind of got the most emotional response out of me. Not to say like I read this book as emotionally dead or anything along those lines. But that was just kind of one where I got, people talk about certain things with 1984 and events happening. It's like, oh, I got chills. Well, that was the moment for me. I got chills. And maybe part of the reason why I didn't really experience that so much with 1984 is A, we've heard so much about 1984 being quoted, and B, because Orwell is directly referencing, I say directly referencing, but, he's directly implying kind of these critiques of Nazism and Stalinism. It's like, oh, well, I've seen all this stuff. And I think we're one aspect of the present day, especially with like the telescreens, because technology obviously has advanced so much in the last 70 years. But we still see this sort of thing in like modern day communist China, except they just use technology to enforce it now. Social credit scores. So, but it's the same song and dance. It's just a different tune. So other thoughts that I had about the book is Winston and Julia's relationship. Personally, and their rebellion, as I like to term it, while I think in the book... Oh, and we're kind of getting into spoilers here. So, you can go ahead and end the video if you'd like. Overall, I very much enjoyed the book. I would recommend it to anyone. And I think there's a lot to learn and enjoy about the book. So those are kind of my general feelings about it. And just remember to just kind of read it and study yourself. That's how I would approach this. So going back to Winston and Julia, their relationship, it is kind of strange. It's strange how it starts, but the whole setup is strange, with this world of Big Brother and Ingsoc and telescreens and thought crime and whatnot. So it's not that it doesn't work in the story. I think it actually works in the story very well. It's just kind of, the premise is a little strange, but the world is strange. So that's how, basically by swapping paper and pretending to not actually swap notes to each other, that's how the relationship is started, and people just have feelings. And there's a few weird thoughts that Winston has too that I found a little bit weird. Like he wanted to murder Julia when he first saw her. And it's just kind of like, okay, where did that come from? But one thing is that I think there's a certain shallowness to Winston and Julia's relationship and to the rebellion. It feels very much just kind of like, oh, well, we're rebelling by having sex. And it's not that it's graphic, and it's not that it's gratuitous, but as opposed to many aspects of 1984, it doesn't really feel like there's deeper layers to it. It just feels like, oh, well, we're sticking it to the man. And I know within the book, the thought process is by sticking it to the man, but by sticking it to Big Brother, somehow, they don't really explain. I mean, they do kind of, but I don't think in a sufficient enough way. Somehow, by sticking it to the man, that's going to cause everything to collapse, because we'll get enough people doing it to stick. We'll get enough people to stick it to the man that the society collapses upon itself, and that Big Brother will go down with it. However, within that, I still kind of feel that relationship between Winston and Julia, although I very much enjoyed it, it still feels very superficial, in my opinion. And I think it's a little at odds with the depth of the rest of the book. Another aspect of the book, if I'm going to kind of have a little negative here, is Winston's, I don't know how you want to call it, his deconversion, reconversion, or conversion scene, depending on how you look at it. When Winston at the very end basically just believes all the party propaganda hook, line, and sinker, and believes exactly as any good Ingsoc citizen should. Any member of the party should. I do. The issues that I have with that is, I think now, George Orwell, he wasn't religious. I know that much. Whether he was an atheist or agnostic, I'm not sure. And the only reason why I bring that up is I think there is a certain absence of the human spirit in regards to when Winston's being broken down, because they use absolute brutal torture to break him down and accept this world, this post-truth world of Ingsoc. You know, we're basically 4 and 4 equals 5, and no, that's not a commentary on anything happening in today's society. That's in the book, although it's a little creepy when you hear about that. Or when, you know, O'Brien, who's this person who's doing, you know, these things to him, and also previously was kind of a mentor figure to him, but as it turned out, you know, he was actually with Big Brother the whole entire time. You know, when he talks about, oh yes, I could float from the very ground if I so willed it, and basically by the meaning by that is he wouldn't actually be floating off the ground. But what is reality doesn't matter, because everything the party does is reality. That is reality. What is in the mind is reality. There is nothing external. So within those two aspects, I think, you know, while we're going through these scenes with Winston, you know, and he's like, oh, and he's raising all these objections and things of that nature, and the responses are fantastic. But the fact of the matter still remains, there is reality. You know, I can drop a rock. There's my hand. I can drop a rock and gravity still happens. According to party logic, if the party dictated that, oh, well, no, the rock did not fall. The rock did fall. It doesn't matter what happened, the rock fell, gravity still exists. Now, to credit Orwell's point, could a thought and a philosophy get to such a point that people believe whatever, even when they're staring straight at reality? Yes. And I think, you know, we're seeing that, at least, you know, speaking to American society, we do see examples of that. Well, people will stare at reality and they can stare at the facts, you know, at objective truth, and they still believe a falsehood. Why? And I think that's part of the reason of what George Orwell is writing. They believe those things because they want to, and specifically within the context of the party. And this is one very unique aspect of the party, and I think, and it ties into one of the weaknesses of the conversion scene, in my opinion. The party, they're absolutely selfish. They realize that what they're doing, they're like, yeah, we're just doing this for power. You know, we're not trying to better people. We're just trying to be in power. So this is the plan that we came up with. And it totally fits within the world. However, as a warning, I think it falls a little bit flatter, because while I do believe that there are most certainly people who just desire power for power's sake, who feel that they should rule just because that's what they desire, that's what we want. You know, because one of the things that Winston levels at O'Brien is he says, oh, well, you know, you're doing this for, you know, for the betterment of humanity. And O'Brien tortures him and says, "Oh, how could you get that so wrong, Winston? We're not trying to do this to better anyone." Um, and I think one weakness of that aspect of 1984 is that you go through history. You take the most horrible people, Mao, Hitler, Stalin. We'll just take those three just for examples. Every one of them did what they did because they thought they were making things better. Now, could there be some aspect of it of them just wanting power for power's sake? I will totally agree that that may have been a point. But even if every single one of them was just doing it for power's sake, they still wrapped it up in, oh, well, this is for the betterment of the people. And why? Why do people do that? Because there is an emotional response. Because people will do anything, will do the most horrible, atrocious things if they feel that they're bringing about a better future, if they're bringing freedom of a sort, food, equality, whatever the thing is that's being fought against, people will do every sort of depraved thing imaginable because they think that they're doing a greater good. So that's reality. Obviously, this is a fiction novel, so there's most certainly allowed to take, to have creative license there. However, I think that's kind of a little bit of a failure in the metaphor, in that, at least as so far, and I'm not saying that a government like Ingsoc couldn't exist, but at least insofar where we're at and in any sort of reasonable near future, something like Ingsoc, like Big Brother happening, is an impossibility, because even the most horrible people in the world so far are still emotive beings, are still doing things because they think that there is a just and good reason. They're not just doing it, they're not doing everything just for power's sake. And if they have done it just for power's sake, they've still wrapped it up in these emotive causes. So basically, in the ending, the party is able to keep complete control because they are able to supplant everything for their desire for power, because power is the ultimate goal. If there was a society like that, a society like Ingsoc could exist forever, because they understand the important part. It's about keeping power. We're not trying to keep appearances. We don't care about people. But people aren't that way. We are spiritual beings. We have a soul. We believe in good and evil, in right and wrong. Those are kind of aspects that aren't really touched upon in 1984. And so, in another way of Winston ultimately giving up and giving in and loving Big Brother, because that's how it ends, he realizes he loves Big Brother, is that 1984 doesn't acknowledge really that people, and yes, religion is the most specific example that comes to mind, but people can be very fervent about non-religious things. But that basically Big Brother has this foolproof system, at least as it's shown, because basically as you go through the book, you kind of think and believe, oh, well, there's the threads are pulling apart, there's these little ways out, there's this rebellion, and it kind of feels like, oh no, the whole thing, even the rebellion, for lack of a better term, is orchestrated. There is no rebellion. Everyone that you thought was an ally actually isn't. They all work for Big Brother. So it looks like Big Brother, in the book, if there is any actual threat to Big Brother, you don't actually see that in the book. So, just taking on face value, there is no threat to Big Brother. Big Brother is immortal. It's invulnerable. It is absolutely powerful. So, everyone eventually succumbs to the torture of Big Brother. That's, there isn't anything mentioned otherwise, because the whole point of the torture is, as opposed, which is very interesting, to, Stalinism specifically, that just killed, millions of people because they disagreed. The point of Ingsoc is they're not into purges. It doesn't mean they won't kill you. But if they do kill you, They will at least kill you with you believing all the right things. You will finally be liberated. For them, belief is the most important thing. And that's more important than crushing opposition. They want you to love Big Brother as they love Big Brother. They want you to see the world as they tell you to see the world. And so in regards to that, one aspect that I think is totally not touched upon in 1984 is this example, is the reality of existential reasons of existence, whether that is religion, or it could just be a sense of justice, or it could be a cause. Is that, okay, yes, in a world where these aspects wouldn't exist, which there's no reason to believe why they don't exist in 1984, they're just not touched upon in 1984. Okay, yeah, everyone would eventually succumb to 1984. But there are people that would never, we have examples of people that do not recant their beliefs that suffer the most gruesome torture and death. Even if Big Brother has it perfected in room 101 to the absolute most horrible fear of your imagination, whatever that may be, that's the surefire way to break every single person if everything else fails. That, there are people that wouldn't break even under that. Yes, it may be horrible, it may be terrifying, but their belief is more important than that. And that's something that's not touched upon in 1984. That's not something that we see in Winston. And maybe George Orwell did that purposely to kind of show that, hey, anyone can be brought to this state. And I think that's an important point to make. It's an important point of reflection for myself as well. But as someone who has deeply held convictions that I feel that I would die for, under the worst sort of torture imaginable, I think that's a very big missed. I don't even know if I would say it's a missed opportunity, but I just think that is a part of the human experience that just isn't touched upon. So it's just in kind of this warning. If you imagine 1984 as an equation, I feel that it is missing an important variable to that equation. And so, my personal belief, and obviously you're free to disagree, my personal belief is that a society like Ingsoc could not exist because of those factors, because there are things that people believe in that are more important than their very own lives, than their very, very own painful existence, if it were torture, and that even the most horrible people in the world do things, in positions of power, because I understand there are psychopaths, there are sociopaths, but even the most horrible people in positions of power, at least as far as we can tell, they never did the things just for power's sake 100% of the time. There was always some emotive reason, there was always some sort of appeal to a greater good, however that may have been. So I think the absence of mentioning those two things are two weaknesses of 1984. However, even with all that taken into consideration, 1984 is an extremely powerful book that, as I said before, I recommend anyone should read. Anyone should take it as a moment of self-reflection and just thinking, just to kind of analyze the world that they live in, and maybe also how they think about their beliefs and how they express those beliefs. It is, I wouldn't say that it's one of my favorite books of all time, but I have a very hard time ranking favorite books of all time. But it would definitely be in consideration, and I'm very, very glad to have read it. So anyways, that was a very long review, and I probably forgot quite a few things. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for bearing with me. If I think I got this at a library sale. You can get 1984 pretty cheap. I'll have probably a link in the description, just in case you're interested, just for convenience. I'm not popular or famous. I don't have any affiliates. Nobody cares about me, But I hope you're all doing well, that you enjoyed it, and I look forward to doing more reviews like this in the future. Remember, I appreciate each and every one of you very much. If you liked what was going on here, please feel free to give it a like. And whether you liked it or not, please let me know. Give me a comment. I appreciate any and all feedback. And remember, what we create matters.